the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Hello, I hope you had a great bank holiday, and we turn now to the biggest test of public opinion between general elections. There are obviously full elections in Scotland and Wales, also elections for all the London boroughs, a third of most metropolitan counties, although in the case of Birmingham, the largest local authority in the country, it's an all-out election. There are also elections in some unitary authorities, and it's a big test of the Prime Minister, but it's also a test of the real strength of Reform UK. Have they peaked? How well will the Greens do? Are the Conservatives or Liberal Democrats going to do well? Liberal Democrats usually do well in local elections, and we'll be considering all of that. Also, very sadly, of course, the whole issue of anti-Semitism has really raised its head, and we'll be discussing the implications of that, and also congratulating King Charles, who had a very successful visit to the United States. Against some predictions, he weaved his way through formality and also delivering some subtle messages to President Trump. So to discuss that, we have Martin Liptrop, who's the Director of Strategic Partnerships here at Downtown in Business, and the lovely Joe Phillips, former aide to Paddy Ashdown. Joe, why don't you sort of give us your initial thoughts on what's at stake in these elections and what might happen?
Now, there are fantastic similarities between me and Professor Sir John Curtis, because we're both allotment holders. But let's not talk about the plight of my cabbages or his slug invasion. I think these elections will be more interesting, actually, in what happens in Wales and Scotland. My prediction is that in London, the Greens will do well at the expense of Labour, and Reform may pick up some of the outer London boroughs, which used to be sort of part of the Greater London Authority. But I think, there are a couple of things that I would be particularly interested in. One is the turnout, which is traditionally quite low for local council elections. And I think if it is below 30, then we've got a really big problem, because it means people are just not engaged and they're thinking, they're all as bad as each other. The Liberal Democrats, as you said in your introduction, Jim, do traditionally do well at local level, and they do generally perform well where they are in councils across the country. But I think there is a sense of, they've got, more than 70 MPs, they've done really well, but actually, are they going anywhere? They're not moving in the polls. And it may be that, it's time to think about a different leader, because Ed has done really well in taking to this level. But maybe they need some new blood, new energy, and ramp up their campaigning a bit more. My own feeling, and I don't know how much of it is wishful thinking, is that Reform may have peaked. There's a lot of stuff swirling around the party and Nigel Farage in terms of allegations and claims about hefty donations to him personally and to the party.
Pulled out of Kunzberg on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Was booked to do the programme and pulled out.
Well, yes, which, maybe for perfectly good reasons, we don't know. But I think that and his closeness to Trump has been a real problem in the eyes of the voters. And of course, we know that there are at least 40 candidates, I think the Guardian or Observer picked on, who have got pretty dismal records of homophobic, racist and downright unpleasant social media things. So, their much lauded vetting process doesn't appear to work. The Conservatives, I think, will probably do better, because they can't do any worse. It's a question of, and we'll talk about this next week, I'm sure, how will the press play it? Is it going to be a disaster for Labour? Yes, we know it is. But, there are more nuances in this that I think, the Tories, if they don't lose any more seats, might be, able to say they're doing quite well. If Lib Dems increase their share, they've got a story to tell. And if Reform and the Greens don't do as well as predicted, then that's a story as well. But I think all eyes will probably be on Wales.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We have to remember that these elections were last up, and it's quite important in terms of analysing these things when they were last contested. And there was quite a difference between 2021, when Scotland and Wales last went to the polls. Johnson was on a bit of a bounce after the COVID operation. People generally thought before all the revelations came out, that he'd done a good job. By 22, of course, he was on his way out. And that's when all the elections in England were last contested. And it was a really bad time for the Tories. Martin, your general take on things?
I think you've raised a real important point there. Last time these seats were contested was Partygate. And as you say, Boris was on his last legs. And this was a low watermark for the Conservatives. It's likely they may lose seats from that low position again this time. And you've got to wonder what the longer term future is for Conservatism as we see it today, when it's hemorrhaging support to somewhat unpleasant far right and further right parties. And there seems to have been an end to one nation conservatism that was perhaps the bedrock of, the Tories' generations long success at the polls that was before us. There's 5,000 seats up for grabs. I think we're looking at Labour losing, north of 1,000, heading towards 2,000 of those, and the Tories potentially losing 500 seats. I think for the Conservatives, it's hard to see how they come back from that. Labour will probably, because of the strange nature of 1/3 votes in some places, cling on to power in some authorities that will give it breathing room, at least, to try and reverse its fortunes over the coming 12 months or more. But I think a few consequences of what happens on Thursday are the interesting thing for me. I think Joe's right. The Welsh and the Scottish devolved authorities are going to punish Labour hard. If we look back at the three most recent by-elections, obviously up in Runcorn, where we are up here, Manchester, and in Caerphilly in Wales, Labour got punished hard and lost to the Greens, Reform and Plaid. So they've seen their vote disappear everywhere. I think there's a chance that Plaid could be perhaps the kingmaker in Wales, and people may back them over the Reform and the Green options that are presented there, seeing them as perhaps a more competent political force. In Scotland, Labour may finish third, and that's unheard of, isn't it, from where they've been in the past. But for me, the biggest kind of story that's going to come out of this is what happens with our devolved authorities in the UK. You're going to see what has been pretty much Labour hegemony in most places unravel, because where I am, Liverpool City region, there's a strong chance that the St Helens leadership might fall to Reform. And then, of course, the combined authority no longer speaks with one voice. It has a dissenting voice in the room who probably doesn't think that they're going to create policy. After all, Reform was very light on policy, but might see it as his or her job, whoever gets the position as leader, to just frustrate and challenge and slow down and prevent. And you finish up then with, just as we're on the cusp of national government gifting the powers that have been promised for a decade or more to the regions, to the city regions, it all starts to get much more difficult because the politics have changed around us. The same is true in Birmingham. If you look at Walsall, you look at Birmingham City itself and other places where control may change. So I think it's a challenge to a lot of other institutions as well as local councils.
Yes, that's a very, very interesting point about the future of devolution. Let's sort of go around the country a little bit more detail now. I mean, let's start off with Scotland, because the argument is being made that if the Scottish nationalists do return either with near enough a majority, and the British government still refuses their call for a second referendum on independence, that they can turn around and say, well, on what basis was that? Because the Labour government has, got into power with a fairly low share of the vote and nevertheless believes it can legitimately rule. I mean, do we think there's any chance at all that the government would have to give in to the calls for a second referendum, Joe?
No, I think it will just be a lot of noise. I mean, I'm not sure that there is a huge clamour in Scotland, although, the SNP might be the least worst option, and John Swinney has done quite a good job of bringing them back after the sort of hiccups of Nicola Sturgeon and her ex-husband and the various sort of scandals that were swirling around the party,
which we were reminded of by Joanne Cherry in a book that she's just published, No Friend of Nicola Sturgeon.
But I'm not sure. I still think, everything is about the cost of living. And I think that, it might be something that, yes, we will have another referendum on Scotland. But, to run a referendum costs a lot of money at the same time as you're cutting services and you're looking at cutting further. And I'm not sure that that would be the thing that people are voting for, really. So I think
you're dead right. Look, the SNP are going to be borrowing votes in this election from Tories who are now homeless, and traditional Labour supporters who are fed up with the Westminster administration. They're not clamouring for independence. Right. They're lending their vote to the SNP as a protest at the moment.
Turning to Wales, here the situation is that it looks as if Plaid, under their very impressive leader, actually, might well be the largest party, but not able to form an administration. And Reform might do quite well. If it was just turned around the other way and Reform were the largest party, but Plaid and Labour and the Liberal Democrats could deny them power, what do we feel about that? If Reform were the largest party in Wales?
I think it's unlikely, personally, and we saw how people, if you like to use Martin's phrase from the discussion about Scotland, people lent their votes to Plaid in that by-election to stop Reform. And I think there will be quite a lot of pressure. And although it will be, whatever happens, will be bad for Labour, Wales is a principality that has got Labour running through its veins like coal. And I think that it would be very difficult for people to find a way to let Reform in. I think they might pick up a few seats, but I think, it goes back to what Martin was saying just now, Jim, and actually what we discussed with Frank last week, that I think we are going to see more and more areas, whether it is the Senedd in Wales or whether it's county or local councils across the rest of England, where there is no overall control. And that means that you have to have some political nous and some political skill, because if you're going to deliver for the people who voted for you, you have to make decisions. You can't just play it like that famous parish council meeting, with somebody just going, no, I'm not going to play. People still need stuff to be sorted out. So in some ways, what we might see is a sort of a sophistication, if you like, if people can rise to that challenge of working with opposition parties. And given that we know we've got a completely fragmented political system with 5 main parties now, then actually, the next general election, this could be quite an interesting foundation.
You're on the money. So what's really happening isn't a polarization politically, it's a polarization by party. We've still got a rump of people on the left and another rump of people on the right. They're just split across a wider choice of party to represent them than we've had in the past. Labour, Tory was the choice of old. Now you've got 3 or 4 Hughs on the left and 3 or 4 Hughs on the right to follow. So you're seeing a political system that's first past the post party based, that's now going to have to struggle or adapt somewhat to reflect what's going on here. I think you'll see Plaid probably being the largest party in Wales, and with the support of a few Green, Labour and Liberal Democrat seats, be able to form an administration. It's uncomfortable and new and challenging, but I think that's what we're going to see. And it may well also be that you start in future elections to see a lot more formal arrangements between parties, joint tickets, standing downs, etc., to try and reinforce these things. And I don't think we're used to that. We've got an appetite for that.
Outside London, and we'll come on to the London boroughs in just a moment. Outside London, the focus is clearly going to be on how reform might do. Martin, you've given us some very helpful insights into what might happen in St Helens. Now, the general presumption seems to be that reform will make a breakthrough in the northeast, perhaps in places like Sunderland. But So that seems to be the main area. So let's focus on the contest in Birmingham, because it is extremely important. It is the largest local authority in the country, over 1 million people. And here the position is even further complicated by a large number of independents, which, for the sake of discussion here, I hope you'll accept, we can, of course, say that one of their principal concerns is Gaza. Which that alone, because it is Gaza, it is a foreign affairs issue, has introduced a new element into British politics, and to some extent a problematic issue. I don't know whether, Martin, you've been in touch with our colleagues in Birmingham, because downtown has an important presence there. What's the feeling on the ground as to if a very complicated result could come through there?
Yes, there's a few places around the country where a huge number of independents are standing on a range of reasons. Definitely there is a kind of Gaza and Palestinian cause that's reflected perhaps in some Asian communities. I think there's been a history in the past of us in the mainstream parties being able to do deals and negotiate with independents. They've stood sometimes as disillusioned councillors or people who've lost the wit for one reason or another, and we've been able to kind of corral them back into a working relationship where effectively they don't challenge budgets or they don't step in the way of manifesto commitments. I'm not sure that this new breed of independent, which seems a little more ideological, seems a little bit more fundamental, I'm not sure it's up for negotiating. And I think that's more of a worry, and it might find that there's a great difficulty in operating councils, Birmingham and West Midlands areas particularly. Also,
yeah, well, that's the point that Joe was making, isn't it? That people, when they're elected as councillors, particularly if they're going to be in the running cities and places, they've got to focus on the day-to-day issues of ironic here, I'll come on to this in a minute, clearing the bins and things like that, and ideological positions on foreign affairs, whatever they may be. If you're only focused on that,
but it works both ways. So you can't. You can't not accept that that's the decision that the electorate has made. So even if they're more inclined to punish central government for foreign affairs issues, if that's how they're going to use their vote, that's how they're going to use their vote. It's true also on the other side. The white working class, where I come from, is often pigeonholed as being a bit racist and a bit nasty and voting for reform, and that's about immigration issues that aren't particularly tied to how your local authorities run and whether your bins are emptied or not. So we've got this polarization right across the political spectrum that's not useful from a local government perspective, but really gives you an insight into what's changing at a rapid pace in British politics.
Joe?
Well, I think, it is absolutely that thing that you can stand as an independent because you feel very strongly about Gaza or whatever it is. and people may well support you because they agree with you and they, you know, all the rest of it. But as we have seen where Reform have taken power, and where I'm speaking to you from in Kent, you can have those slogans, you can have all of that stuff, but you have got to, and you are statutorily obliged to deal with things like adult social care and children with educational special needs, etc., etc. I mean, the bin strike in Birmingham, which seems to have gone on since, well, before downtown was founded, I think, and possibly even before you were born, Jim. I don't know whether you might have been around at the beginning of the bin
18th
strike.
century, I think.
But apparently, you know, the unions have been talking to Reform, which is an astonishing thing.
Can I?
According to Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
Well, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but
yeah,
I need
absolutely.
just to my take on this is that the Labour leadership and Unite have done a deal which would be implemented after the election if John Cotton, the Labour leader, had any say in the running of Birmingham. But there are commissioners in the city who have not endorsed this deal, and unkind commentators, of which I am of course not one, are suggesting that Cotton and the Unite have given this impression to try and help in the local elections, and it may not actually see the end of the bin strike. I don't know if anyone's got any further takes on that, but that's what I've heard.
Well,
Anyway,
I think you know, that's the problem, isn't it? And whatever deal is promised, but will only come into operation after the election, is a pretty rubbish deal, because, you know, once the election's over and done with. But, you know, I mean, as we know from speaking to Kevin in the past, it's only parts of Birmingham. It's not the whole of Birmingham that's overrun with rats the size of tigers. You know, it is just one of those things. But, you know, local government, as I often say, touches people's lives every day in a way that national government doesn't. So it is really, really important. And, you know, with the dearth of and demise of local newspapers, local radio reporting, it's actually quite hard for people to know what's going on in their local communities. So you do end up with politics becoming polarised, and politics, unfortunately, becoming about what's happening in Westminster. And, you know, the thing is, well, use it as a protest vote because you can't stand Starmer, even though your Labour council candidate might be absolutely bloody brilliant.
On this tour of the country, let's just finish off, Martin, with the London boroughs. Some suggestion that Labour might get some sliver of hope in the London boroughs. Are you picking that up at all?
Little bit. Feels like they might cling on to some. I mean, they've got 22 under their control at the moment, and nobody imagines they're going to have more than 10 or 11 at the end of it. I think there'll be a lot of no overall controls with Labour as the largest party. And back to what we were saying a bit earlier, deals will need to be done. It looks like Reform's only real strength is up on that kind of Essex borders. That looks like where they're going to be, and the Greens are floating around in some of the perhaps younger and trendier boroughs, Hackney and the like. Tower Hamlets is going to be an independent-led authority by a huge margin, and there's going to be all different flavours and styles of independence. So they may even have to put together a coalition of independents. You know, we're getting to the realms of fantasy politics here at the moment. But I think Labour's going to hold on in some of the places where it really matters, the Brents of the world, and I think that they're going to have the opportunity, because of the system, they're going to have the opportunity to rebuild over the next 12 months. But it's got to be a warning shot across Starmer's bows if he's got any chance of still being there in September to use the King's speech to do something dramatic.
And I think it's, you know, if he's not already put it in the draft of the King's speech, then he certainly ought to be thinking about PR and introducing it and mentioning that in the King's speech, because, you know, we are no longer in the position that we were even 5 years ago, never mind 10 years ago. This sort of fragmented politics, which isn't necessarily bad, but it isn't necessarily easy in very difficult global times and under straitened financial circumstances, that it might be more sensible to say, right, we need PR, because that way, you know, you can work properly.
Do you
So-
think there's a remotest chance, Martin, that Labour will do that? Because in the past,
Now,
they've always said, however
I-
bad it is, our time will come again, and the Labour Party's
Yes.
best chance is first past the post.
Yes, I think obviously Jo's got a Lib Dem background and PR's always going to be in her King's Speech. I think that we've also got to ask ourselves, do you think the Greens and Reform will be around in 5 years' time? They're likely to explode. I mean, the leader of the Greens seems he's all over the place and is losing his own support internally, and Reform look like they're going to have some other challenges from other quarters with the way they're organised as an entity. They could be out of the picture in 5 years' time, and it might return back to the good old days of us versus them.
Well, it might do, but the other way of looking at it is that if the Greens and Reform implode, you've then got people who might have voted for those who become homeless, who wouldn't support Tories or Labour or the Lib Dems or the SNP or Plaid in Wales and Scotland, then you've got a huge chunk of people who are, they're either going to go down the route of they're all rubbish, I'm not going to vote, which is not good for a healthy democracy, or you see another insurgent party from right or left come up.
Or a reckoning from the Conservatives on the right and Labour on the left that they need to review their policies, and this kind of broad churchism that's dragged them to mean nothing to anybody has to come to an end.
Yeah, or you see, Reform and the Conservatives unite, which, both Badenoch and Farage have said no, never. But given that Farage has got most of her former cabinet colleagues in it, it wouldn't make that much difference. But that's if there is some support for Rupert Lowe's, whatever his party's called, Restore or something or other, that's eating into Reform. That maybe there needs to be a realignment. Maybe, there will be people in the Conservative Party, people in the Labour Party who would find the Liberal Democrats a more comfortable home, perhaps under a different leader.
That's for the middle distance. Let's come back to the more immediate thing just before we finish on the local elections, because on Friday and Saturday there'll be rampant speculation about the future of the Prime Minister. There was a strong story at the weekend that there are 100 Labour MPs prepared to sign a letter and to be sending that off to him on Friday. It seems, Martin, as if the sort of acid test is if Labour lose 1,000, then he can survive. If it was 2,000 councillors, he would be in desperate trouble. What's your latest take on whether Sir Keir Starmer's going to make it to the King's Speech?
Yeah, well, hopefully he'll make it to the King's Speech. He's got to wait a week, so I can't see Labour's leaden-footed machine being able to move quick enough. 100 letters would be great for the Tories because that would go to the 1922 committee and their process would be triggered. We don't have that on the left. It would just have to be unbearable pressure that was what forced him out. I think he'll remain. He'll be given the summer to perhaps shake it up, a cabinet reshuffle perhaps again, and a clearer articulation of what he stands for. And if he can get to conference season here in Liverpool in September, that might be where there's a serious challenge to him. I can't see it happening before, partly because there's nobody to back. The one that they all think is strongest, Andy Burnham, hasn't got a seat. Sadiq Khan hasn't got a seat, and there isn't really anybody other than Ed Miliband knocking around who's even expressed any interest in it in the cabinet at the moment.
Martin's absolutely right. I think Keir Starmer will stay, mainly because there is no one to replace him. Angela Rayner's still got this shadow hanging over her about her tax affairs. Andy Burnham is not an MP. Wes Streeting is the only person who could feasibly do it because he's an MP. But actually, what does it get you? It doesn't get you anywhere other than really annoy the public to think, oh, here we go again. We keep changing the leaders of political parties and nothing changes. And I think Keir Starmer can probably hold on until the autumn. It may be that he is forced to do a reshuffle. He could do something amazingly intelligent, like put Andy Burnham in the Lords, give him a seat at the cabinet and make him a minister for devolution or local government or something like that, which would actually then scupper his plans of ever coming back as an MP.
Andy's not going to take that bait, is he?
Well, I don't know. If you've got a seat at cabinet, you can have a lot of influence, but you don't have to then risk giving up Manchester and possibly losing a by-election. I mean, you know, can you imagine how awful it would be that they all think Andy Burnham is, you know, he's not the Messiah, he's a naughty boy sort of thing, that actually there is a by-election, he doesn't win, the Greens or Reform win it. So Labour have lost Manchester and they've lost Andy Burnham coming back into the Commons. And I just think, you know, what is going on in the rest of the world is far too bloody important. And far more serious to all of us, every single one of us, than what is going on in the Labour Party. And, you know, get rid of Rachel Reeves, have a bit of a reshuffle, really focus on the things you need to do, and say to your backbenchers, if we don't do these things like welfare reform and what have you, and raising, increasing spending on defence, then other parties will do it, and they will not do it as well as we think we can do. You know, he's got that choice.
Well, when we do our next podcast next Monday, we'll have most of the results in. I mean, people don't appreciate Thursday night ain't going to be a great time for the results. Most of it's coming through on Friday. Even Saturday, the picture may become clearer. So Downtown will be well placed to do analysis next week. But let's just, before we finish, turn to two other issues. And firstly, the whole question of anti-Semitism following the stabbings last week and the burning of the ambulances and things like that. Let's get to the heart of this, which is the contention by the Jewish community that a lot of these pro-Gaza marches with their chanting of from the river to the sea and global intifada are very strong messages to create anti-Semitic atmosphere, and the need for our Jewish community to be going around with massive security, young children having to go into schools where they see huge fences up, and the arguments for free speech, what actually from the river to the sea means, and you can't ban marches and things like that. It's a real dilemma for a democracy as to how to handle this. But that seems to me to be the essence of it. Joe, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think, you know, the protests directed at Keir Starmer last week when he went to Golders Green, you know, Keir Starmer, Jew harmer, are absolutely ridiculous and completely and utterly unjustified. You know, this is a man who actually did more to root out anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and got rid of Jeremy Corbyn. I think, you know, there are so many issues here. But I suppose the biggest one facing the government at the moment is, do you ban marches? Well, if you're going to ban Stop the War Coalition, which has been around for donkey's years, who are holding a march next Saturday, then you also have to ban Tommy Robinson. You can't just ban, I mean, I think the government made a terrible mistake by declaring Palestine Action a terrorist organisation, because those marches then attracted a whole bunch of people who, by and large, are not necessarily fully informed about the history and, you know, the nuances of the whole Middle East conflict, but they've come there because they don't want to be banned. It doesn't do anything at all for the people of Palestine. And I think just as we should all stand up for the Jewish community so that people don't feel frightened, they don't feel under assault, that they feel, you know, they are absolutely have every right to go about their business, as do Muslim people living in this country. And I just think there's an element of sort of picking and choosing here, that if you're going to ban marches, presumably you are also then going to ban the regular protests outside asylum hotels. What we've seen, and I think to a certain extent we are all, every single one of us, slightly complicit in this, we have seen the level and vitriol of speech become so everyday, mainly through social media and promoted through bots and algorithms that are probably not from human beings, and that it has become totally, utterly unpleasant. What we saw in Epsom, in Surrey, a couple of weeks ago, a woman claimed to have been raped in a church. Within hours, there were men protesting in Epsom. The police had to go and calm down a near riot, because the assumption was these would be illegal immigrants who had carried out this attack. As we now know, it appears there was no attack. But this sort of speed with which people will jump to conclusions, and this hatred is fueled by words and suggestions from people like Nigel Farage, you know, that everybody coming over on a small boat is an Iranian operative who's here to cause mayhem and terror. We actually have to start calling it out a bit more, and that is, you know, to the benefit of the Jewish community, but it's also to the benefit of all of us. But I just think you go down the route of banning marches or banning certain phrases, you can't do it.
Kemi Badenoch seemed to say that she thought the Gaza march should be banned, but perhaps not the Tommy Robinson
I heard that, yeah.
march. But yeah, because her analysis was that the far right do not create a, I mean, we're probably on the heads of pins here, a particular attack on a particular community, which results from the pro-Gaza people. I mean, do you have any sort of sympathy with that? It's complex.
No, you can't use that as an argument. You know, I'm sure there are perfectly decent people who go to support Tommy Robinson's, whatever his march is called, you know, for reasons that are totally understandable. And I'm sure, like any event, that you will get the wrong sort of people who go for the wrong sort of reasons. But, you know, it was only 2 weeks ago that London was packed with millions of people for the London Marathon. You know, there was no problem. People enjoyed themselves. It was a fantastic event. It was well organised. It was well policed. I think the Metropolitan Police are being slightly disingenuous, because next weekend you've got Stop the War Coalition, you've got Tommy Robinson, you've also got the FA Cup final. So regardless of what's happened with the anti-Semitic attacks over the last few weeks, it may well be that the police, along with the leaders of the various London boroughs that those events would be taking place in, and the Home Secretary, could have said, hang on a minute, we're a little bit overstretched. Could we move this to the Sunday? You know, the police do have powers, so do local authorities. You can keep something as a static event so that it's not actually a moving march. And I think I heard Kemi Badenoch, and I just thought you were just going round in circles. You know, it's just ridiculous.
We should stress, Martin, the difficulty the police have, you know, people shouting out particular slogans. I mean, you can't arrest 100 people for shouting the wrong thing. And then, of course, we had the very interesting spat between the Commissioner of Police over the way in which the Golders Green assailant was wrestled to the ground, and Zach Balansky sort of said this was over the top, and then he's withdrawn it. But it shows the great difficulty the police are having with the you know, where politics and public order interface.
Yeah, it's a thankless task, isn't it? I think you're on a losing wicket if you're trying to nuance phraseology in a mass march somewhere, and who said what, where, and where, and how do you police that? It's important. The sad news is that what we're seeing is a huge rise in intolerance on all sides. The Jewish community, of course, experience of this scapegoating and this kind of attack from a broader wing of society will be fearful, and are fearful of how this could potentially escalate. I think government's got a tough job in trying to police and regulate speech and protest. But I think if you're in the red wall or the blue wall or whatever colour the wall is these days, there are some issues that are within the control of the government that are fueling and impacting on this growth in intolerance. You'd have to put immigration in there. It's an uncomfortable subject for people on the left to talk about, and they tend to shy away from it. On the right, it's a movement. It gathers pace and it wins support. You've got to look at welfare. You've got to look at, was it £5 million a day for asylum hotels? You know, these things are irritating to lots of people in the nation. Now, there's a reluctance to get involved in those conversations, but that's what our world in Britain looks like now. We've got to go to the root cause of what some of these protests are being fueled by, and it's uncomfortable. It's ugly. It's the nasty side of politics that's reared its head. But it's got to be dealt with. It can't ignore it. It's got to be dealt with.
I would just say, Jack Straw, when he was Home Secretary, very well intentioned, brought in a law about racist chanting at football grounds. There is an excellent documentary that won a Sonny Award, produced by somebody within this group of people, because we called it the law with the flaw, because it was impossible to police and prosecute, because you had to have a certain number of people chanting at exactly the same time in order to say, right, you know, you're all banned. Now, in the same way as the Palestine Action things, so instead of people standing there with banners saying, you know, I'm protesting for Palestine, they put the word action on, they're committing a criminal offence. It's impossible, as you say, Martin, to do this sort of nuance. But I do think, you know, we need to be, and you're absolutely right, we have become so intolerant. We're so quick to jump to conclusions, to have a comment, to have a thought, and then go, and people, oh, I went out too quickly, like Polanski. I mean, how ridiculous.
What has worked in eradicating or reducing at least the mind as racism that used to be on the football terraces was the intolerance of other people in the stadium to it. When somebody started making monkey noises or calling people names, there was a big bloke behind you, slapped you around the ear and said, enough of that, quit it.
Yeah.
And a bit of self-policing worked wonders on the terraces. The terraces.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it is that thing of calling it out. It's about calling out your colleagues when they make homophobic or sexist comments in the pub after work. It's about what you say at football matches. It's about having those conversations with children, with school children, with students. It's about actually saying, you know, you might think that the Israeli government is utterly appalling and Netanyahu is a murderer, but how can you blame somebody who was born in this country, lives in this country, who can't vote in Israel, has got nothing to do with it? That's like blaming every American for Trump and the Iran war. And I do think, you know, you're absolutely right, Martin. These are the really difficult issues that too many politicians have shied away from because they're too hard.
Right. Let's finally turn to King Charles, who went to the United States in what potentially could have been a very fraught visit, and pulled it off magnificently, including, and the key thing for me was where he told the Congress that American courts had frequently referenced Magna Carta in their judgments, which had put a limit on executive power. I mean, that was so elegantly done. Joe, I'll come to Martin with all his experience in America in just a moment, but Ed Davey called for Prince Charles or King Charles not to go. Any further reflections on the fact that he actually pulled it off?
Well, I think it was a mistake for Ed Davey to do that. You know, the king is far more experienced, and, you know, as his mother will have trained him, they're used to meeting ghastly people. You know, we know the story of the Queen hiding in the bushes in Buckingham Palace so she didn't have to bump into Ceausescu when he was over on a state visit. And I think Charles did he did everything that Trump could only even dream of. You know, he was elegant, he was eloquent, he was witty, he was warm, but he was nuanced. And the points he made, as you say, Jim, about Magna Carta and checks and balances, about NATO, about Ukraine, about the Royal Navy, and all done with ease and grace. And it was I thought it was an absolute blinder. I bet they got on that plane to come back, and I can imagine Camilla saying, make it a large one, darling, get me a packet of Marlboro extra strong.
After the Magna Carta reference in the congressional speech, Martin, I thought Trump wouldn't be able to help himself, but he didn't hit back, did he?
He was in, like, if you watch C-SPAN or whatever the British equivalent to that is, and it panned around the joint hearing of Congress, everybody's faces were in awe. It was delight. It was a performance for them. They, you know, something that they haven't seen in their own politics, statesmanship, for a very long time. and they loved it. And I haven't seen any hard and fast figures, but I would imagine that the standing of the UK as an entity in America rose dramatically over the 3 days of the visit. I would think also that more people are inclined to come to the UK to spend their vacation dollars going forwards, and the monarchy and all its trappings and castles and all the rest of it is a big draw to UK PLC when it comes to the visitor economy. And I think even if there have been a bit of toe treading between the politicians, I think that the special relationship, and I'm married to an American, so I have the most special of relationships.
Oh, lovely.
Is as strong as it's ever been, and that's what we want and what we all recognise is important, that the UK and the US continue to shape what the world does, says and looks like.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. And just to reassure people that I was not present to report the signing of the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215. I thought one of you would have run that gag, but you didn't. Anyway, thank you both very much indeed. We'll be back next week with full analysis of the local government elections, and let's see what the situation will be. But as Martin has said, we could see a somewhat compromising of devolution by the presence of reform in certain local authorities. Perhaps even more importantly, we could have Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales leadership of people who do not really want to be part of the United Kingdom, and that will play out over a period of time. So lots to talk about next week, but for now, thank you for joining us and goodbye.